There are moments when fear seems to know exactly where to find you. It knocks on the door of the mind, walks in uninvited, and starts rearranging the furniture of the heart. Suddenly, everything feels smaller: the plans, the faith, the courage. Fear has that power. It shrinks what God designed to be great. And yet there's one thing fear has never learned to do: remain. Because fear lives in the moment, but love lives in the eternal. Fear feeds on control. Love blooms through surrender. Fear calculates, love trusts. Fear demands certainty, but love prefers presence. That's why in the end fear always falls, not because it grows weak, but because it meets something stronger. God's love doesn't arrive shouting or trying to prove its strength. It comes quietly, draws near slowly, and where the heart is closed, it simply stays. It stays until fear grows tired of fighting, until tears lose the taste of despair and become prayer. That's how love wins, not by force, but by constancy. Maybe you're still afraid right now, afraid of losing someone, afraid to start over, afraid to fail again. But know this: fear doesn't define you. It only reveals how deeply you need to remember you are loved. And God's love doesn't change when fear appears. That's exactly when it becomes most real. Fear is loud. It shouts at the wrong time, interrupts peace, and tries to steal focus. But love speaks softly, and still the soul recognizes its voice. Because the voice of love doesn't compete for volume, it brings direction. That's why, when fear begins to fall, silence no longer frightens. It becomes the sound of God's presence. And in that place, when the heart begins to rest, love shows its strength. It's not the romantic kind built on human promises, but the eternal love that never gives up. The love that held you through the nights when you couldn't hold yourself. The love that reminded you without words that there's still hope even when you feel nothing. In the end, it's always the same. Fear falls and love remains. And in that remaining, everything is rebuilt: the courage, the faith, the life. Because God's love doesn't just overcome fear, it transforms it. And when that love finds you, you realize peace was never the absence of fear. It was His presence, right in the middle of it all. There are moments when fear doesn't just visit, it tries to rule. It slips quietly into decisions, changes the tone of thoughts, and before we know it, it's already dictating the rhythm of the soul. Fear itself is not sin, it's a reflection of human fragility. The problem begins when it takes the throne of the heart, when we start believing more in what we feel than in what God has promised. Little by little, fear convinces us that it's safer to stop than to keep trusting. But God never called us to live under fear. He called us to be perfected in love. As it says in 1 John 4:18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love. This love doesn't force us to be brave. It welcomes us even while we tremble. Love doesn't erase the feeling of fear. It changes the place fear occupies within us. In the Bible, men and women of faith also hesitated. Moses feared returning to Egypt. Elijah fled into the wilderness. Peter began to sink when he took his eyes off Jesus. And yet, God remained with each of them. Fear was never a sign of divine absence, only a reminder that we are still learning to trust. God is not offended by our fear. He simply invites us to bring it to Him instead of hiding it. When fear tries to rule, it steals clarity and feeds the desire for control. But control is an illusion. Love is what truly sustains. Fear says, "What if it doesn't work?" And love replies, "Even then, I will be with you." It's in this silent dialogue between fear and faith that the heart begins to mature. Confidence doesn't begin when fear disappears, but when we learn to remain even while it's still there. Maybe the secret is to stop fighting fear and start presenting it to God. Fear grows in the dark, but loses strength in the presence of light. When we pray sincerely, when we confess that we're afraid, the soul becomes a place love can inhabit. It's like lighting a candle in a dark room. Fear might still exist, but it no longer controls the atmosphere. Fear survives in silence, in what we hide. But faith breathes in the confessional of the soul, that moment when we whisper, "Lord, I'm afraid, but I trust you." And in that simple surrender, something changes. The heart that opens to grace discovers that fear may shout, but love speaks deeper. God's presence doesn't just comfort. It redefines what is threat and what is refuge. And that's how fear begins to fall. Not by the strength of will, but by the strength of presence. When love enters, fear loses its authority. The heart, once a prisoner of uncertainty, learns to rest. And in that rest are born the first signs of freedom. The kind of freedom that doesn't come from the absence of fear, but from the certainty that God is near. That leads us to the next step, understanding that fear doesn't come from the absence of God, but from the distance we feel from His presence. Fear rarely comes from what is real. It grows in the space between us and the awareness of God. It feeds on silence, on delay, on the feeling that we prayed and heaven didn't answer. It's in that gap that the mind creates monsters and the heart convinces itself that it's alone. But the truth is that God never left. He just doesn't always manifest Himself in the way we expect. Faith begins to weaken, not when He is silent, but when we stop noticing how near He still is. The psalmist understood this when he wrote, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Psalm 23:4. David didn't deny the valley or the fear, but he affirmed something greater, the presence of God. He realized that the shadow isn't a sign of absence, but of nearness, because there can only be a shadow where there is light. Fear may surround us, but it can never separate us from the shepherd who walks beside us. There's a difference between feeling and knowing. Feelings change daily, but knowing sustains the heart. When fear dominates, it convinces us that the absence of emotion is the absence of God. But God's love doesn't depend on what we feel. It remains constant, even when imperceptible. Mature faith learns to rest in truth, not in sensation, and one truth remains forever. God is still here. Think of Elijah, hiding in the cave, wishing to die. He expected to find God in the wind, in the fire, or in the earthquake, but He came in a gentle whisper. Sometimes that's what fear tries to block, the silence needed to hear God's voice. Fear speaks loudly, God speaks softly. That's why the heart must grow still to recognize the presence that never left. The distance we feel from God is not always real. Often it's the distance created by our restless thoughts. Fear turns our gaze inward, while faith lifts our eyes. When we stare too long at what we feel, we forget to look at who is with us. That's why prayer is more than asking. It's aligning the heart to the rhythm of divine love until the mind remembers what the Spirit never forgot. God hasn't abandoned us in the valleys. He simply chose to walk in silence through them. And that silence isn't empty. It's care wrapped in waiting. He doesn't withdraw when fear arrives. He draws closer. But fear is blind to that nearness. It sees the valley, but not the shepherd. And that's exactly where grace works, opening the eyes of the soul to see the invisible. Fear doesn't grow in darkness. It grows in isolation. When the heart believes it's alone, it weakens. But when it remembers the faithful presence of God, fear loses ground. Out of that awareness rises true courage. Not the kind that denies fear, but the kind that walks through it hand in hand with love. And from that meeting between presence and trust, the next truth is born. Love doesn't erase fear, it redefines it. Many believe that love and fear cannot coexist, as if one must disappear for the other to exist. But in truth, the love of God doesn't come to erase fear. It comes to transform it. It doesn't deny what we feel. It simply changes the place each feeling occupies within us. Fear may still exist, but it no longer rules. It ceases to be a voice and becomes a reminder that we must stay close to the love that never changes. The word says in 1 John 4:18, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love." The text doesn't speak of eliminating fear, but of casting out torment, the weight that fear brings when we believe we are alone. The love of God doesn't just comfort us, it changes the meaning of fear. It transforms it from a threat into an opportunity to trust. Jesus never promised the absence of storms, he promised his presence within them. When the disciples saw the waves rise, fear took over. But Jesus slept, calm, unshaken, because love doesn't panic. When they woke him, he didn't rebuke them for being afraid of dying. He reminded them of who was in the boat with them. That's how love redefines fear. It teaches us that even when everything seems out of control, what truly matters remains in the right hands. Fear is how the human heart tries to survive. Love is how God teaches us to live. Fear says, protect yourself. Love answers, trust. And between those two voices, the soul learns that true safety isn't found in avoiding pain, but in walking through it with the one who is greater than it. Love doesn't remove the hardships of the road, but it walks with us through every one of them. When love reigns, fear loses its throne. It may try to rise again, but it no longer holds authority. It's like a shadow before the light, still there, but powerless. That's why Jesus calls us to remain in love, not just to believe in it. To remain is to decide every day, even when I'm afraid, I choose to trust. And that quiet kind of trust is what turns chaos into rest. There is spiritual power in allowing love to teach us how to face fear instead of rejecting it. Divine love doesn't erase memories or ignore scars. It redeems them. It takes what was once a wound and turns it into a testimony. It takes what was weakness and turns it into wisdom. When love sits at the center, fear stops being an enemy and becomes a temporary teacher, one God uses to teach us dependence. Love doesn't eliminate fear, it redefines it. What once felt like a sign of loss becomes a reminder of presence. What once felt like a symptom of control becomes an invitation to surrender. And in that new meaning, something deeper begins to grow: trust. Because when fear falls, the space it leaves behind becomes the ground where faith begins to bloom. And that's what the next step reveals. When fear falls, something else rises: confidence. When fear falls, it doesn't leave emptiness, it creates space. And in that space, trust is born. Trust doesn't arrive loudly or suddenly. It forms slowly, like sunlight breaking through the fog. At first it seems faint, but it's enough to see the next step. Faith doesn't begin when fear disappears, but when we choose to move forward even while fear is still present. The psalmist wrote, "In God I have put my trust, I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me?" Psalm 56:3-4. He didn't say this from a safe place, but in the midst of danger. David learned that true confidence doesn't depend on circumstance. It is born from the conviction that God remains God, even when the world falls apart. Fear shouts, "What if it all goes wrong?" Faith replies, "Even then, he remains faithful." Confidence is not the denial of pain, but the affirmation of presence. It's the heart saying, "I don't know what will happen, but I know whom I trust." It's the kind of faith that doesn't need understanding to endure. When we trust, control stops being the goal and peace takes the place of despair, because confidence doesn't live on predictions. It lives on promises. And God's promises never fail. Peter discovered this when he began to sink. Fear made him look at the wind, but trust made him reach out his hand, and there, between sinking and being lifted, he learned something fear could never teach, that the presence of Jesus is more stable than the ground beneath. To trust is to reach out even when your feet no longer touch solid ground. It's to believe that grace is stronger than the fall. Trust also appears in small gestures, in the prayer whispered when you feel nothing, in the hope repeated on colorless days, in the choice to keep believing without evidence. It's in those quiet moments that God builds the strongest kind of faith. Confidence is the invisible response to the visible love of God. It's the heart learning that being held is better than trying to hold yourself up. Little by little, fear stops controlling the rhythm of the soul. It still tries to rise, but it no longer finds a place. Love takes its rightful seat, and the heart discovers that confidence is freedom. It's the soul taking a deep breath and saying, even if I can't see, I know the Lord is here. That's the kind of rest the world can't explain, but heaven recognizes as mature faith. If you still hear fear whispering, remember this: it only speaks loudly when love is about to win. Take one more step, even if your hands shake. God is already on that path, because faith grows when the heart dares to listen again. And if these words are reaching you where human voices can't, stay with us, subscribe, and let these quiet reflections find you again. Fear, as uncomfortable as it feels, carries a hidden purpose: to reveal our need for love. It doesn't come only as an enemy, but as a mirror. It shows how much we still try to control what we can't, how often we seek safety outside the presence of God. Fear isn't the end of faith. It's where faith begins to be tested. And paradoxically, it's in that place that the love of God becomes most visible. The psalmist declared, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Psalm 27:1. David didn't write these words during peaceful times, but while being pursued. He learned that fear is a reminder that something greater is holding everything together. When fear arrives, it's not a sign of spiritual weakness. It's a sign that we still need to go deeper into the love that casts out fear. Fear reveals where love has not yet fully arrived. It exposes the corners of the heart still resisting surrender. That's why we shouldn't hate fear. We should listen to it. It whispers the parts of the soul that are still trying to protect themselves, and it's precisely there that God desires to dwell. In the cracks, in the gaps, in the places self-reliance has abandoned. Love doesn't seek perfect hearts, only available ones. When fear speaks, it says, "You're alone." But love answers, "I never left you." Fear tries to prove there's no way out. Love shows that God Himself is the way. That's how fear becomes an involuntary teacher, guiding the soul back into the arms of the Creator. Love doesn't overcome fear through denial. It conquers through nearness. Jesus knew what it meant to feel fear. In Gethsemane, He sweat drops of blood while crying out to the Father. Yet even there, in anguish, He submitted to love. "Not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22:42. It was in that moment that fear revealed its true role, not to push away, but to draw closer. Fear exposed the depth of obedient love, the love that chooses to remain when everything around says to run. When we look at our weaknesses with compassion, something changes. We stop trying to defeat fear by strength and begin to defeat it by grace. Fear is not a sentence. It's a reminder. It's not the opposite of faith, but the opportunity to exercise it. And every time we choose to trust in the middle of fear, love grows a little more inside us. So when fear knocks on the door, don't hide it. Bring it to God. Say with honesty, "Lord, I'm still afraid, but I choose to trust you." It's in that kind of prayer that the soul matures. Because fear brings us to the edge, but love teaches us to cross. And when the heart learns to listen along that crossing, it discovers something new. Love speaks deeper when fear grows silent. Fear is loud. It speaks over everything, interrupts silence, and tries to fill the whole mind. But when it begins to fall, something sacred happens. The heart finally hears what the noise was hiding. Love doesn't shout, demand, or compete for attention. It whispers. And it's in that whisper that the soul begins to recognize the voice of God. Fear might be the first sound we hear, but love is always the last. The psalmist wrote, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." Psalm 46:10. God didn't say fight or prove. He said, be still. Silence is not the absence of an answer. It's the place where the answer begins to take form. Fear feeds on movement, but faith grows in stillness. When the heart grows quiet, love finds space to speak. There are truths that can only be heard when the inner noise fades. While fear rules, everything inside us feels urgent. But when love takes its place, time slows down. The soul learns to breathe again, and prayer starts to make sense once more. Silence stops being empty and becomes presence. Because God's love never forces itself, it gently fills the space fear left behind. Elisha heard God after the chaos, Elijah in the gentle breeze after the storm, Mary in the quiet murmur of an angel in an ordinary room. Scripture is filled with moments when the divine revealed itself through a whisper. It reminds us that God doesn't hide from pain. He only changes his tone so we can learn to listen differently. His presence never leaves. It only waits for the heart to listen again. When fear rules, the soul rushes. But when love reigns, time slows. Faith stops being a race and becomes a walk. The heart begins to recognize the voices, fear, which demands, and love, which comforts. It's in that quiet discernment that the deepest revelations are born. The ones that come not from sermons, but from presence. There is a kind of wisdom that can only be born in stillness. When we stop trying to understand and simply remain, God speaks without words. He speaks through a memory of care, the soft chill of a sincere prayer, the comfort we can't explain. Fear teaches us to ask, love teaches us to listen, and in listening, faith matures. Finally, when fear goes quiet, the heart discovers something precious. Love doesn't speak about safety. It speaks about permanence. It doesn't promise the absence of pain, but the presence of God within it. And it's in that stillness of listening that the heart understands God's love is the solid ground where fear stumbles but never wins. And that is exactly what the next step reveals. There are moments when everything seems to collapse. Certainties crumble, human promises fade, and the heart loses its ground. It's in those moments that the love of God reveals its unshakable nature. When everything falls apart, love remains. It doesn't depend on what the world builds. It stands on its own because it comes from a God who never changes. Fear may tear down walls, but love rebuilds entire homes within the soul. The word says, "Many waters cannot quench love. Rivers cannot wash it away. If one were to give all the wealth of one's house for love, it would be utterly scorned." Song of Songs 8:7. That's what God's love is like, unquenchable. Storms may rage, but there's a flame no wind can put out. This love isn't a fleeting emotion, it's an eternal foundation. It's what remains when control is lost. Job lost everything he had, but he discovered that the love of God isn't measured by possessions, it's measured by presence. Paul was imprisoned, yet wrote letters full of joy. John was exiled, yet received visions of heaven. Love didn't spare them from suffering, it sustained them through it. And that same love continues today, holding every heart that chooses to believe. When love remains, fear loses its purpose. What once seemed like an ending becomes a beginning. What once hurt now teaches. Love doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. It takes broken pieces and turns them into something new, something that couldn't have existed without pain. That's the silent miracle of grace, transforming ruins into refuge. Love is also patient. It doesn't rush healing or force understanding. It simply stays. And that constancy heals more deeply than any answer ever could. While fear demands explanations, love offers companionship. While fear runs, love waits. It's that quiet presence that rebuilds everything panic has destroyed. Some people only recognize God's love when everything that upheld their image of stability fell apart. Sometimes you have to lose the ground beneath you to realize that love is the true foundation. Love doesn't need a stage, only space. And when the heart surrenders to it, emptiness stops being a threat and becomes a dwelling place for His presence. And when everything else fades, love is what remains, steady, silent, eternal. It's the living reminder that God is still God, even when we understand nothing. This love is the ground that catches our stumbles and teaches us how to rise, and that leads to the next step. The love of God is the ground where fear stumbles and finally falls. Fear is unstable. It needs fragile ground to survive, but the love of God is firm. It's the ground where fear stumbles and falls. Fear lives on what if, but love lives on even if. Fear tries to predict, love simply trusts. And in that quiet contrast, the soul finds balance. Fear may shake your voice, but love steadies your steps. It doesn't remove the valley, it turns it into a path. Paul wrote to Timothy, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, and of love, and of a sound mind." 2 Timothy 1:7. True courage doesn't come from the absence of fear, but from the presence of love. The power that comes from God is gentle, not arrogant, steady, not harsh. It gives us authority over fear, not so that we ignore it, but so we can put it in its rightful place, beneath the feet of faith. Love is spiritual ground. It holds firm when logic fails, when the world stops making sense, when tomorrow feels too far away. It's on that ground that a weary soul learns to walk again. And each step, even a trembling one, is a testimony that grace is enough. God's love isn't only shelter, it's direction. It doesn't just receive, it leads. Think of Peter again. He began to sink because he stopped looking at Jesus. Fear made him lose his footing, but love lifted him up. The hand of Christ is the ground that reaches out when faith falters. That's the beauty of grace. It doesn't condemn the fall. It teaches us to rise at the pace of love. Every stumble becomes a reminder that we never walk alone. God's love is also moderation, the balance between what we feel and what we know. It teaches us to breathe before we react, to trust before we understand. While fear rushes, love remains. While fear accelerates, love slows down. That's how the heart learns that security isn't found in the absence of risk, but in the constancy of divine presence. And it's precisely when love becomes the ground beneath us that fear stops being a threat and becomes a story. It still tries to whisper, but it's lost its power. The heart, upheld by grace, learns to walk lighter, to see what once frightened it through different eyes. Because now every step comes with the quiet assurance, "The Lord is with me." If these words are bringing peace to your heart, if you sense that love is finding you in the middle of uncertainty, let this journey continue. Subscribe and walk with us, one video at a time, one step of faith each day, because sometimes all God needs is a willing heart that keeps walking, even when the ground still feels like it's shaking. True love doesn't need answers to remain. It stays, even when meaning hides. It's easy to trust when everything makes sense, but the love of God calls us to remain precisely when nothing does. That's when love stops being emotion and becomes decision. To love God in the middle of confusion is the highest kind of faith. It's declaring that He is still good, even when we don't understand His ways. The Bible says, "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." 1 Corinthians 13:7. This kind of love doesn't run from pain, it deepens through it. It doesn't fade when fear tries to return, it anchors itself in promises. To remain is to stay when everything in you wants to run. It's to believe when logic says to give up. That's how love matures us, by turning what could have been surrender into devotion. Abraham lived this truth when he climbed the mountain with Isaac. He didn't understand, but he obeyed. His love for God taught him to trust even without explanation. In the end, he discovered that true love doesn't demand understanding. It requires surrender. The heart that trusts doesn't need to see the outcome to keep walking. Abraham climbed without visible guarantees, sustained only by the invisible certainty that God would provide. When love is greater than fear, obedience stops being a burden and becomes worship. Love also teaches us to wait. It helps us understand that not every silence is rejection and not every delay means absence. Sometimes the love of God reveals itself precisely in the in-between, in what we don't yet understand. The soul learns to remain not because it knows what's coming, but because it trusts the one who leads. That is the essence of mature faith, to rest before seeing the result. When we choose to remain, something shifts within. Despair loses ground, pride grows quiet, and the heart learns to listen with gratitude. It's in the staying that the soul is shaped into the likeness of Christ. He himself, hanging on the cross, chose love when everything around him made no sense. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. Even in pain, love remained. God's love doesn't teach shortcuts, it teaches constancy. It shows that peace isn't found in understanding everything, but in trusting the one who does. To remain is a silent form of worship, a whispered yes spoken through tears. And it's in that yes that fear loses its final power. Because the love that remains doesn't need guarantees, it only needs presence. And when we learn to remain, the heart realizes that love isn't just the road, it's the destination. Love is the end and the beginning of every story. It is the first breath and the final rest. It's what held us at the start and what will receive us at the end. And that's exactly what the next and final step reveals. Love is both the beginning and the end of all things. Everything begins in love, and everything ends in it. Before time existed, there was love. In the beginning was God, and God is love. Every act of creation was born from that heart that longed to share life. And even after the fall, when fear entered the world, love remained. It didn't retreat from the darkness, it entered it to redeem. From Eden to the cross, the story of humanity has always been God's attempt to remind us of what we've always been, loved. Paul wrote, "And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." 1 Corinthians 13:13. Faith leads us, hope sustains us, but love completes us. It is the thread that weaves every chapter of existence, the strength that lifts us after fear, the calm that steadies us in storms, the voice that calls us home when we've lost our way. Love is the beginning of every new start, the reason behind every act of forgiveness, the essence of every promise. The love of God is not a passing emotion, it's an eternal presence. He was the first to come looking for us when we ran, the first to call us by name when sin tried to erase us. The love of God is patient, not because it ignores our failures, but because it believes in who we can still become. It doesn't measure us by what we've done, but by how much of His heart we can still reflect. Jesus is the living proof that love is more than a feeling, it's sacrifice. On the cross, love didn't just overcome fear, it transformed it into salvation. What was once a symbol of condemnation became a symbol of redemption. The cross is where love and fear met, and love prevailed. It was there that love proved itself stronger than death, deeper than despair, and more enduring than any fall. That love didn't end at Calvary. It crossed generations and reached us. It's the reason we still breathe, the voice that still whispers, "Do not fear," the fire that still warms cold hearts. The love of God doesn't grow old. It renews itself every morning. It's the strength that lifts the weary and the light that guides the lost. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And when everything else fades, riches, plans, pain, and glory, love will remain. It is the foundation of what was and the destiny of what will be. At the end of every human story, the love of God will still be standing, waiting, like the Father in the parable of the prodigal son. Because eternity is nothing more than returning to the love that never gave up on us. So when fear falls, when faith is fulfilled by sight, and when hope becomes reality, what will remain is love. It will be both ground and sky, embrace and home. And there we will finally understand what we can only sense now, that everything was sustained by love. For fear falls, faith grows, but love remains, and it's love that carries us into the dawn. Fear tries to make us forget, but love always makes us remember. Remember where we came from, who called us, and that we were never alone. Every pain, every waiting season, every silence, none of it was in vain. They were simply the paths through which love reached us in different ways. Sometimes with strength, sometimes with gentleness, but always with purpose. Maybe today you still feel afraid of the future, afraid of losing, afraid of not being enough. But remember this, fear doesn't define who you are. It only reveals how much you still need to feel the love of God. And that love is here. It doesn't come demanding courage, it comes offering rest. It's the love that holds you when faith trembles, that restores when hope grows weary, that warms when the heart turns cold. If your heart is tired of fighting, take a deep breath. Close your eyes and imagine yourself placing that fear into God's hands, not as someone giving up, but as someone choosing to trust. Just say, "Lord, I place this in your hands." That is the symbolic act of this reflection, the simple gesture of letting love take the space fear once occupied. Because when fear falls, what remains is not emptiness, it's grace. And grace fills everything. It turns tears into prayer, doubts into trust, and silence into communion. The love of God is the ground where you can rest, even when the world seems to fall apart. He is the unchanging answer, the presence that never leaves, the voice that keeps whispering, "Do not be afraid, I am with you." And if this reflection has brought peace to your heart, subscribe to the channel. That way, the next time fear tries to return, these gentle words can find you again. A soft reminder that love is still here. In the end, this is all that matters. Fear falls, love remains, and it's love that teaches us how to remain too.